So hello and welcome to this Introduction to Cultural Studies NPTEL course, where we're looking at Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. And this will be the final lecture on this particular text, where we're looking at the conclusion in some details, because the conclusion sort of sums up the entire text quite beautifully and also offers some really radical arguments which can take us forward in terms of connecting with the other texts that we do subsequently in this course. Now, on page 188 on your screen, we find this paragraph beginning where Butler sort of sets out to define what she had done in this particular book, Gender Trouble, where she says, "This task has required a critical genealogy of the naturalization of sex and the bodies in general. It has also demanded a reconsideration of the figure of the body as mute prior to culture, awaiting signification, a figure that cross-checks with the figure of the feminine, awaiting the inscription as incision of the masculine signifier for entrance into language and culture." So quite clearly what Butler says over here is that this is a critique of the idea of a body, the idea of a self which is pre-culture or pre-discursive, right? Similarly, it's a critique of the idea of the feminine as pre-masculine, right? So the feminine is already embedded in the masculine signifiers, in a masculine system of signification, and she makes an entrance into it by the very process of being a female. So this idea of a body being a mute prior to culture, pre-culture, pre-discourse, that is critiqued by Butler in this particular book, throughout this book actually. From a political analysis of compulsory heterosexuality, it has become necessary to question the construction of sex as binary, as a hierarchical binary. So this is a key question that Butler does throughout this book. She questions the concept of sex as a binary, heterosexual, homosexual, etc. This binary, obviously, which comes with a hierarchy where heterosexuality is, becomes a compulsory privileged condition, a desirable condition. This kind of binary, this dualism is critiqued and deconstructed by Butler in this particular book. From the point of view of gender as enacted, questions have emerged over the fixity of gender identity as an interior depth that is said to be externalized in various forms of expression. Right, so this idea of a gender being one of depth, a sense of depth, a sense of interiority, which is articulated through acts of expression. So this becomes a fallacious argument according to Butler. So Butler said this is an erroneous way of looking at gender, and there's fallacy in this particular perspective where we assume interiority, we assume a certain degree of depth from where expressions are enacted through acts of representation, etc. So that kind of a model, according to Butler, is an invalid, is really an erroneous model to look at gender. Because according to her, there's no sort of boundary between the inside and the outside. It's always a liminal condition, which is neither purely organic, neither purely biologically determined, neither is it purely arbitrarily artificial. So there's somewhere in between. There's a degree of liminality that Butler points out as being one of the necessary conditions of gender identity and gender politics. So the implicit construction of the primary heterosexual construction of desire is shown to persist even as it appears in modes of primary bisexuality. So even in modes of primary bisexuality, that kind of a hierarchy occurs that is retained, where the heterosexual construct is privileged, is given a degree of desirability, etc., or dominance, etc. So that becomes a dominant construct, that becomes a dominant discourse, even in seemingly radical narratives. Strategies of exclusion and hierarchy are also shown to persist in the formulation of the sex-gender distinction and its recourse to sex as a pre-discursive as well as a priority of sexuality to culture, and in particular the cultural construction of sexuality as a pre-discursive. Right? So again, the idea of pre-discursivity is exposed as a hollow construct by Butler and is critiqued by Butler, and she sort of flags it up as an erroneous category, as an erroneous conceptual category. Finally, the epistemological paradigm that presumes the priority of the doer to the deed established as a global and globalizing subject who disavows its own locality as well as the conditions for local intervention. So this epistemological paradigm that prioritizes the doer from the deed, in other words, that retains a sense of the pure self, as opposed to discursive activity. That kind of a model where the binary between the pure self, which is a doer, and the discursive activity, which is a deed, that binary is retained. As long as the binary is retained, that kind of establishes or invests itself to global grand narratives. right, which completely conceal its own local quality, which completely conceals its own constructed quality, and of course it does away with any possibility of local intervention. So local intervention becomes a true site of subversion, according to Butler. And again, notice the way in which this kind of an attitude, this kind of a theory is allied fundamentally, epistemologically, as well as ontologically, with the postmodernist theory, which is more keen, is more curious, is more interested in micro-local narratives rather than the grand narratives of consensus, agreement, culture, etc. Right? So that kind of an epistemological paradigm is critiqued by Butler, is deconstructed by Butler, is decried by Butler. That kind of a paradigm that presumes the priority of the self, that presumes the priority of the pre-discursive self as a doer. It is prioritized over the deed. That retains the schism, that retains the binary between the romantic, reified self with an interiority, with a depth, etc., which is in opposition to the discursive activity, right? So according to Butler, there's no self which is also not on discursive activity. So every self is also a discursive activity. It's an activity which produces a self, it's a self which produces activity. It's a form of a loop of production and reproduction that Butler is interested in foregrounding and theorizing. And that is what the entire discourse of gender trouble is, foregrounding the loop between the self and the activity, right? The self is a product of activity, and activity is a product of the self. It's sort of a loop process of entanglement which goes on asymmetrically. Okay, right. If taken, this is page 189 on your screen now, if taken as the grounds for feminist theory of politics, these effects of gender hierarchy and compulsory heterosexuality are not only misdescribed as foundations, but as signifying practices that enable this metaleptic misdescription remain outside the purview of a feminist critique of gender relations. So this kind of a misrepresentation of hierarchy and compulsory heterosexuality manages to escape feminist criticism, manages to escape feminist critique by appearing as meta-discursive, by appearing as a universalized and totalized narrative, which is outside of discursive field, which is outside of discursive activity. So this is a misdescription, obviously a manipulated misdescription, which is sort of designed in a way as not to be discursive. So the very design resists any discursivity over here, and Butler is interested in examining and exposing the innate discursivity of this seemingly non-discursive process. It manages to become non-discursive, it manages to remain non-discursive by remaining outside the purview of a feminist critique of gender relations. So any true feminist critique of gender relations, according to Butler, must take into account local interventions, must take into account local narratives which resist and which question the entire ontology of the grand narrative, which appears to be a meta-discursive construct, meta-discursive given. To enter into the repetitive practices of this terrain of signification is not a choice, for the I that might enter is always already inside. So again, the I is always already inside the discursive field, the field of discursivity. So there's no pre-discursive I, there's no I which is not always already embedded in that kind of a discursive activity. Okay, there is no possibility of agency or reality outside of the discursive practices that give those terms the intelligibility that they have. So we are back again to the question of agency. So agency and identity can only be derived from engagement with discursivity, with acknowledgement of discursivity. So true agency or true identity cannot be derived from any idea of a romantic non-discursive self, which is sort of divorced from discursivity, which has interiority, integrity, and a degree of depth, which somehow manages to live outside of discursive field. So the discursive field is like a magnetic field, really, where everyone is affected. Every activity, every body, every self, every agency is sort of affected in some way in this particular magnetic discursive field. So nothing can escape the discursive field, nothing can escape the textuality of this process of signification. So nothing is non-textual, nothing is a given outside textuality. Okay. There is no ontology of gender on which we might construct politics. For gender ontologies always operate within established political contexts as normative injunctions determining what qualifies as intelligible sex, invoking and consolidating the reproductive constraints on sexuality, setting the prescriptive requirements whereby sex or gendered bodies come into cultural intelligibility. So gender ontologies always operate within established political contexts. So we can't possibly take outside or take away the political context from gender activities or gender ontology. So every gender ontology is determined by the contextuality, and contextuality obviously is synonymous or is a form of discursivity, right? So the normative injunctions determining what qualifies intelligible sex, which consolidates the reproductive constraints. So all these activities, all these constraints, sanctioning of intelligent identity, etc., or intelligibility, etc. So intelligibility, reproductive ability, agency, identity are all contained as processes, as permutations and combinations inside a particular discursive field. So you can't take away the discursive field, you can't take away that particular instrument, that particular apparatus which produces cultural intelligibility. Right, so cultural intelligibility becomes a real discursive category over here, and that is allied to identity, that is allied to agency, etc. See, ontology is thus not a foundation, but a normative injunction that operates insidiously by installing itself into political discourses as its necessary ground. So insidiously becomes the key word, the operative word over here, and it's something that I've been talking about even before, and that is it must insidiously plant itself as a construct so as not to appear as a construct. So again, this non-appearance, this non-revelation of its constructed quality is what makes an ontology a grand narrative. So ontology is not a foundation. There's nothing called a foundation. It's actually a normative injunction which is constructed in quality. However, that normative injunction or that constructedness, it operates insidiously, surreptitiously, invisibly. Why invisible? How invisible? It makes invisible its own constructed quality, right? By installing itself into political discourse. So, it installs itself surreptitiously, insidiously into a political discourse as its necessary ground. So by ground over here, Butler obviously means that base which presupposes, which is supposed to be non-discursive in quality, the foundation, the basic structure which we assume to be a given. So obviously this assumption or this installation of the basic structure is an artificial process. However, the artificiality of the process must be concealed, and therein lies the insidious quality of this installation. So ontology is an insidious installation. Again, it's a beautiful description of ontology, and you can go back and sort of recover what Butler had said and rehearse what Butler had said when she said that agency is not opposed to ontology. Agency arises from ontology. Agency arises from a maneuvering, from an engagement with this insidious installments, right? These installations, right? These installations which are insidious in quality. If you engage with them, if you address them, if you maneuver with them, only then will you derive and be able to articulate agency. So agency cannot be a pre-discursive quality. Likewise, ontology is an insidious installation, right? Which passes off as a necessary basic ground for any structure to take place, to be operative in the first place. So the deconstruction of identity is not the deconstruction of politics. Rather, it establishes as political the very terms through which identity is articulated. So by deconstruction, again, the very word deconstruction appears over here. Deconstruction is not destruction, according to Butler. It doesn't do away with the politics. It actually re-invokes the politics. It actually revives the politics. It sort of makes the politics very visible. It actually establishes the political and very terms through which the identity is articulated. What Butler means over here is that every articulation of identity is political in quality. So there can be no such thing as a political articulation of identity. So every identity is political in quality. And if you don't take that into consideration, then obviously you are falling into the trap of a sort of seemingly pre-discursive given, right? So the deconstruction of identity is essentially a highlighting of the political quality of identity. It's not doing away with the political quality. It's actually highlighting an emphasis, an epistemic emphasis on the political quality of identity in the first place. So this kind of critique brings into question, as Butler argues, the foundationalist frame in which feminism as an identity politics has been articulated. So, she talks about feminism and how feminism has been trapped in a foundationalist kind of a politics, in a foundationalist kind of a frame where there is this romantic idea of the self, the romantic idea of the purely feminine self, the sort of very reified idea of the interiorized feminine self. And that becomes a problem for Butler, because that falls into the trap that sort of completely plays into the trap of the foundationalist frame, which Butler sets out to deconstruct. And she says quite clearly that feminist identity must set out to deconstruct this kind of a foundationalist frame. But oftentimes it finds itself entrapped in that kind of a foundationalist frame. So the internal paradox of this foundationalism is that it presumes, fixes and constrains the very subjects that it hopes to represent and liberate. And this is something Butler had said before already, that the entire claim of liberation, the entire challenge of liberation is sometimes completely subverted, is sometimes completely frustrated by the entire foundationalist frame. Because if we are retaining the foundationalist frame in your narrative of liberation, then you're essentially playing back into and getting trapped back into the very foundationalist epistemology which is set out to deconstruct. Okay, so if the liberation narratives, the emancipatory narratives would not work at all if you're retaining the foundationalist frame. And that is a paradox, the internal paradox of this foundationalism. So what Butler does, among other things, in this particular book, is that she also offers a critique of feminism. She offers a sort of a possibility of how feminism can open up from this foundationalist frame and open up into new possibilities by using local interventions, by using local narratives, rather than aspiring for some kind of a universalizing, totalizing grand narrative, which, according to Butler, will basically be an entrapment into the very foundationalist frame, which had historically informed patriarchy, imperialism, and all those other disgusting things which feminism sought out to rebel against. Okay, so there is a paradox that feminism must acknowledge and must move away from. Okay, according to Butler, the task here is not to celebrate each and every new possibility as being a possibility or qua possibility, but to redescribe those possibilities that culturally unintelligible and impossible. To redescribe those possibilities that already exist, but which exist within cultural domains designated as culturally unintelligible and impossible. So, what Butler says over here is intelligibility is obviously a discursive condition. However, the challenge over here is to make something which is seemingly unintelligible and to make the transition from unintelligibility to intelligibility. Therein lies the subversive possibility. If you can make something which is unintelligible, something which lies outside the domain of meaningful discursive field or meaningful discursivity, if you can bring something from the outside of this domain into it, right, and make something meaningful, ontologize something which doesn't exist as an ontology, therein lies the true possibility, therein lies the true celebration of identity politics, right? So true identity politics can be celebrated only through processes of redescription. So it can redescribe the possibilities, those that already exist, but which are designated as culturally unintelligible. Right? In other words, if you can use this model to talk about gender identity, gender politics, we can talk about those marginalized gender politics which are inside the discursive field, because there's nothing outside the discursive field, but which exists as marginalized, unintelligible constructs. So if you can bring those into and make them intelligible, give them voices, make them articulatable, therein lies the true possibility of subversion and the celebration of subversion. If identities were no longer fixed as a premises of a political syllogism, and politics no longer understood as a set of practices derived from the alleged interests that belong to a set of ready-made subjects, a new configuration of politics would surely emerge from the ruins of the old. And this is a new kind of politics that Butler is welcoming, whereby seemingly marginalized, unintelligible constructs can be brought into the fold, can be given voices, can become dominant, can become visible, can become intelligible. So intelligibility and unintelligibility become very, very discursive categories over here. So what constitutes intelligibility is obviously alliance or approximation to the dominant discourses. So the closer you are to the dominant discourse, the more intelligible you are. As a category, as a gender category, as a racial category, as a sexual category, etc., as an ontological category, etc. However, the key to Butler over here is how to sort of permute and combine the different discursive constructs so as to offer more agency, so as to create or generate or produce more agency to those seemingly unintelligible categories. Therein lies true subversion, according to Butler. So cultural configurations of sex and gender might then proliferate, or rather their present proliferation might then become articulatable. So again, the entire idea of being articulable, something which has not been articulated now will become articulable through this process of transition, through this process of cultural configurations, and that can only happen, according to Butler, if we acknowledge discursivity, and then we handle and maneuver discursivity, and within a discursive field we recover what is unintelligible and make them intelligible through certain discursive practices, through certain intelligent practices. Okay. Will become articulable within a discourses that establish intelligible cultural life, confounding the very binarism of sex and exposing its fundamental unnaturalness. So that is the whole point, that it is unnatural. So the entire unnaturalness of what is assumed to be natural, if that can be exposed, if we can expose the fundamental unnaturalness, then obviously therein lies a true triumph of gender identity and gender politics. Okay, and obviously. And the Butler concludes by asking a question, somewhat of a rhetorical question: what other local strategies for engaging the unnatural might lead to the denaturalization of gender as such? Right. So gender becomes, the true aspiration that Butler is sort of seeking over here is to denaturalize any idea of gender. Right. So to expose gender as an unnatural construct, an unnatural rule book, an unnatural discursive field with nothing natural about it. But so obviously what that will do is it will take away the naturalness from compulsory heterosexuality. It will take away the naturalness from the privileged positions in the gender field, in the sexual fields, etc., and offer a more distributive discourse of gender, a more distributive discursive field rather than a more hierarchical discursive field. So the challenge for Butler, to conclude, is not to escape discursivity, but rather to embrace discursivity and to look at a more distributive model of discursivity, to attain a more distributive model of discursivity rather than retain a hierarchical model of discursivity. So ontology, discursivity, these are not enemies of agency, and that's a very, very radical thing to say. So Butler is not saying let's escape discourse, let's get ourselves free from discourse, because that freedom doesn't exist. Butler is very clear about this. So Butler wants to sort of acknowledge discourse, acknowledge discursivity. However, she wants to make discursivity more distributive in quality, and that is the biggest challenge for Butler. Therein lies true radical possibility, according to Butler. So with that, we conclude Gender Trouble. I hope you enjoyed reading this particular text. It's a very, very important text, and not least for people who are interested in cultural studies, because as I say, it's a book which ticks lots of boxes. It's obviously a really, really radical book about gender politics and feminism and subversion in feminist identity politics. But equally, it's also something which keeps drawing on post-structuralism and keeps connecting to postmodernism in a very, very sort of attitudinal kind of a way. And this attitudinal alliance that Butler has with postmodernism is something which is really radical in quality. It's something that makes Butler one of the key figures, one of the key intellectuals in academia today, in critical theory today. So thank you for your attention. With that, we conclude Gender Trouble and move on to the next text in the next lecture. Thank you.